Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and good evening and good morning for everybody else watching us. Today, it's going to be a discussion about national dialogue in Sudan, and we have guests with us here at the United States Institute for Peace, and we have two participants through Skype. I'll make a quick introduction to our panelists today. We have Ambassador Preston Lehman, who is no stranger to Sudanese affairs. He was the former special envoy to Sudan in 2011, and he is a senior advisor to the president. We have Dr. Abdullahi Ali Ibrahim. He's an emeritus professor of African history at the University of Missouri. He had written many articles and books about the religion and politics in Sudan specifically, and decolonization in Africa. We have Mr. Ahmed Hussein Adam. He's a visiting scholar and a co-chair of the Two Sudan Forum at the Institute for Study of Human Rights at the University of Columbia. He's currently writing a book about the conflict in Darfur and the regional and international community reaction to the conflict. And he's also an LLM graduate from Westminster University in UK. And we have, we have Mr. Nasruddin Abdelbari, also a lawyer, graduate of Harvard University with LLM in international law and human rights. He had been a consultant with Open Society Foundation and a senior researcher with Rift Valley Institute. And we have Mr. Majid Jazuli through Skype. He is currently a scholar at Bern University in Germany, and he is a blogger, and he conducts workshops about Sudan and two Sudans actually, and peace building. We have also Mr. Said Al-Khatib through Skype. He is the director of the Center for Strategic Studies. He has been also a member of the presenting the Sudanese government in negotiations before the referendum and with SPLM North. Last but not least, Mr. John Timon. He's the director of the African program. He covers Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia, including other sub-Saharan countries. His focus is conflict prevention and current conflicts. I will just give a quick notes about how we're going to discuss this topic today. Since we have people here in the room with us, they can just let me know when they want to comment on a point. For those who are with us through Skype, please let the control squad know, and they will whisper in my ear, and then I'll give you a chance. The topic of the discussion is the national dialogue and political arrangements. It's going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be about the national dialogue. Why now? Why important? The type, the mechanism, the strategies, and who's going to participate. And the second part is going to be about the security, about the challenges to the dialogue that include security situation in Sudan, political participation, and strategies of how to conduct the dialogue. And after that, I will give, without any further ado, I will ask Ambassador Lyman to start the proceedings because he needs to leave early to attend the funeral of the second president of the USIP, Sam Lewis. So, Ambassador Lyman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank all of those who are participating in this dialogue. Let me start by saying that when I was in South Africa in the 1990s, I asked someone very close to President de Klerk, well, how is it that your government embarked upon this transitional process and negotiation with the ANC and all the changes? And he said that it was in the 1980s that the people at the top of the government came together and realized they could keep this up for a long time. They could probably keep up the apartheid system and ruling for another decade, but they knew they couldn't keep it up forever. So the question was, how could they move through a transition that protected them and their people and still took account that the change had to come? And that led them first into secret negotiations with Nelson Mandela, and then unbanning all the opposition parties and into the transition to democracy in South Africa. And of course, in that transition, the people who had been in government and out and who had been, in many ways, the beneficiaries of the system actually came out well. They're doing well in South Africa. That's what democracy does. It allows for everybody to have an opportunity. In Sudan, the government can keep running Sudan as it has for a long time through a system of patronage, political control, use of militias and military, etc. But it can't keep it up forever. And the cost of running Sudan as it is now is very, very great. So the challenge, the question for the government and for everyone else is, how do you make this transformation? How do you take the steps that say, look, we can't keep this up forever. We have to make a major transformation. How do we do it? And the national dialogue, which has been talked about a great deal, is, of course, a means to start that process going. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be difficult. You have to define exactly what is meant by a national dialogue and who participates. And then you have to decide, what is the authority of the dialogue? Is it a rulemaking? Is it a constitution writing? Is it an advisory group? All those issues have to be worked out, and then the process itself. I would just remind people that once the government in South Africa had made those decisions and opened up the process, it still took 4 years before the election in 1994 that finally brought about the end of apartheid and the democratic liberation of South Africa. So this is a long process, but if the government and all the others are truly committed to a process that will lead to transformation, and a transformation that all Sudanese can not only participate but benefit from, then it can happen. And it can happen without more turmoil, without more conflict, and without more suffering by the Sudanese people.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think of that point, I would like to move to Dr. Abdullah. You were one of the first people who ever suggested this during the first years of the government. I remember you had something called the creative fatigue, and it was written in Arabic, but I think, how do you think things are similar since 2000?
This is like a quarter of a century after writing that. And this is the reason why I'm kind of a little bit pessimistic about the possibility of doing a national dialogue, because you know, we don't want to get into the mistake of seeing dialogue as a good thing and a healthy thing in glamorous terms. In a national dialogue, you are talking, speaking truth to a power, and that makes power irritable. And so we need to be very careful about how to present national dialogue. 25 years ago, I was basing my argument on that all the forces in the country got fatigued. The culture of the Cold War, in which most of the ideas of the parties and things like that were formulated, this culture was falling apart and disintegrating. And so people need to make these revisions. And that was a call. 25 years ago, I'm not sure if the various forces made this recognition that they are out of the game, or that their ideas are so they talk about thawabit, that the constant things that are established, that they are not going to give up on. And there is no culture of forgive, forget, and forgive. And that is the, as the ambassador said, it is, you know, that is the kind of the underpinning of the creative dialogue in South Africa. I remember the time when people, like religious people, called ambassadors of Christ. We haven't had that luck so far in Sudan. And I saw people in Sudan making obituaries of Mandela and talking about his forgiveness and his wide perspectives, while they are really following a very narrow path in their own life and in their own practice. So I'm just saying we really need to take national dialogue with a grain of salt.
Great, thank you so much. We will go back again to the question of accountability and building trust, because we will come across that. Let's go to Khartoum. Mr. Khatib, do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. What do you say about that? What do you
Well,
just
I'll tell
heard?
you what I'll say.
What's that?
Yeah, go ahead. Finish your question, please.
Yes. No, I just want you to comment on Ambassador Lyman and Dr. Abdullahi's comments.
Yeah, I heard a good part of what Ambassador Lyman has said, and that's what I'm going to comment on. My first comment is I would say that the parallels with the South African experience stop at the fact that there was a national dialogue. I don't think that there is any relevance to any other alleged similarities between the situation here and the situation in apartheid South Africa clearly. And but I take his remarks as hopeful remarks regarding the opportunity that this initiative would avail all Sudanese of. It is indeed, as it has been declared, an inclusive Sudanese process. And the invitation is even out there for even the armed groups, if they show any willingness to give the national dialogue at least a first opportunity to other means that they are claiming to achieve their political goals, that would be enough for their inclusion. I think it's a real opportunity, not just a necessity for our situation here. There are both these factors that the country really needs a new minimum of consensus that without which it would be very difficult to see how we could continue to go on, particularly in our regional situation now. When you look to Sudan as part of the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes and the Middle East at the same time, with all that is going on, the Sudanese need to really avail themselves of this opportunity to start this dialogue. I think there is a good opportunity here. The initial responses from many political forces inside the country have been positive, and also responses from outside, let me call them observer nations or friends of the Sudanese peace process. Also, they have been positive.
Thank you. I have a question for you to follow up on that. What what is a dialogue? When you say a dialogue, it was really hard for me to follow if it's something initiated by the government, of course. But you said that the armed group have to come and agree. Uh, uh, why they did not agree, and what is the definition of a dialogue? Because Ambassador Lyman highlighted a very important point that defining the dialogue and the function of the dialogue is very important. What is it that people had agreed to, and what is it that you're offering to the political parties to agree to?
All right, the invitation itself to this national dialogue has, by way of just giving the contribution of the NCP, has identified the agenda points or major areas, four of these areas, and these are: we need to come to a minimum understanding and agreement in regards to one, peace; two, democratization; three, the eradication or the alleviation of poverty; and four, what we call the Sudanese identity. These four areas are areas where we have been this, talking back and forth to each other since 1956, and three side claiming some sort of final word regarding how to achieve peace and how to maintain it, or regarding the democratic system that we need to adopt and adhere to in Sudan. We feel like these are major areas where most of the points of difference between different political schools of thought are to be found and can be resolved. And the objective is to arrive at a minimum of consensus that would be enshrined in the new constitution. And then the field after that would be open, hopefully, and level for every political school of thought to try and develop the political process towards their own ends. I mean, there are certain things that need to be agreed, and then the political difference after that, in a democratic fashion, should be encouraged. These are the areas that we need to discuss, and the objective is to have all this feed into a constitutional document.
Great,
And
thank you
as
very
to your
much.
point regarding the armed groups, I didn't understand your point clearly, but I said that they are included. Nobody is excluded from the invitation to come to the table, and with their agenda. If the initiative said, if anybody wants to add to these agenda items, they are welcome.
Great. We will go back to the armed group at some point when we discuss the security situation. Any one of our panelists would like to comment? Dr. Ahmed Hussein, please.
Yes, I just want to thank the USFP for hosting this timely and important actually meeting on the discussion of power dialogue. And I just would like to say that the crisis of Sudan has reached, very turning point. Either it should be resolved through political and peaceful means, or actually is going to be resolved by military means. So what we need is real transformation. Actually, I prefer actually, the transformations to be through a peaceful means, which actually dialogue can play a tool actually for this kind of transformation. But actually there is no way and there is no time actually, given the situation right now on the ground, that to play games or to buy time or something. So the dialogue has to be all-inclusive, serious, genuine, that can bring all the Sudanese stakeholders together to discuss the outstanding issues that actually led the country to the current situation, even the separation of the South Sudan or something like that. For a long time, actually, Sudanese people, they haven't gathered together to discuss this kind of issue. What went wrong? Why the South Sudan actually separated? Because as we see, the same problems and the same policies that actually led and pushed the South Sudan to separate are existing till now. What we need actually for this kind of dialogue to be as serious and genuine, and to bring the Sudanese people together to discuss, the real issues, the fundamental issues related to the state and religion, issues related to identity, and all this kind of issues. Because the idea is to have a peaceful, democratic transformation in the country. But the government of Sudan, and I refer to a good point that made by Ambassador Lyman, that when he said, referred to the example of South Africa. In South Africa, the apartheid regime at that time, actually, they had the political will. Actually, they took the initiative. They took the first step. And this is actually very important. What we need actually from the government of Sudan also, to have a political will. And to understand that, as I said, there is no any kind of playing tactics or games or to drag the country to another kind of election or something like that. This is very important. But they need to convince the people right now in Darfur, in South Kordofan, and Blue Nile, who are under enormous attacks, who under actually Scorch's campaign. They need to convince them that really this time they need business. They really mean business, and they want this, to be ended peacefully. That is very important, and this actually goes back to the issue of who is going to participate in the dialogue or something like that. But these are the people who are right now suffering a great deal in the ITP camps and refugee camps. You need to convince these people. You need to convince them that the Sudanese state is also their state, and their citizenship will also respect it. This, I think, is very important, and I'm sure, as I said, either to be Sudan, either to be transformed peacefully, and actually prepare the peaceful transformation, democratic transformation of the country, or this work could continue. And as I said, Sudan really at war is with itself. And this is going to be very painful. And actually, Sudanese people, they suffer too much, and they need actually to embark in a national dialogue to discuss genuinely actually the outstanding issues, because we don't want more disintegration. And as I said, if the current situation continues, there will be disintegration in the country, and there will be more actually fragmentation of the country. And as I said, we are going to be like another Somalia or another, one of these countries. But whether this is actually referred to the issue of the ownership itself. I think one of the main things is ownership. We don't want actually the NCP or the ruling party or even the regime to say that we offer this and this. We don't have here donors and recipients. All the Sudanese have to be donors. All the Sudanese actually to have to own the process from the beginning, from the procedural issues, until the substantial issues. In this case, actually, you are going to have a genuine and serious actually process, because as I said, before the government of Sudan said many things about national dialogue, but nothing actually materialized on the ground. So as I said, they need to be a lot of things. They need to take a lot of measures and to give good signals and positive signals to Sudanese people that this time they really mean real business, and they want this actually to be resolved peacefully.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed Hussein. This should also be repeated again in the recommendation when we start to wrap up the first round, because the definition of the dialogue has to be really, really clear. Who's the owner, who gets to do what, and who gets to say what. Because it could be just an advisory function, and this is something maybe we need to discuss also with the challenges, because the government might not give too much if it's not feeling safe. And people are not going to trust a lot if they're not giving what they want. So it's going to be a very a fine line to walk on. Majdi, I want to hear your voice, and if you have any takes on what you have just heard.
The debate you now, yes. the assumption you're making here is that the political conflict could be resolved by means of a negotiation between elite formations. And this, to me, seems a bit divorced from socioeconomic realities in the country. It is assumed that a national dialogue would bring in the major political parties around the negotiation table. However, as far as I can judge, this would exclude vast swaths of the population who do not find political representation in these political organizations, be they rebel movements or be they the mainstream political parties. Of course, this builds up on Abdullah's thesis that the political order that was born out of Sudan's independence has come to a point of exhaustion. And it is this is a very clear diagnosis, and I would like to underline it. It is exactly this exhaustion that makes them less reasonable representatives of the voices of the people in question. As far as I can judge, the types of conflicts that are now emerging in Darfur, for instance, would be very hard to manage by means of an elite bargain. Consider, for instance, the exit of populations like the communities under the leadership of somebody like Musa Hilal or Mohammed Hamdan Hemeti from southern Rizagat outside the political order proper. They don't even now consider the NCP as a representative. How would these populations, who are actually fighting in a sense, be included in a national process that is built on representation of political parties? And what sort of negotiation would that deliver to issues that contribute to forging conflict in Darfur? Essentially, land questions and so on. So my feeling that assuming that an elite bargain would deliver the type of transformation you saw in South Africa is a bit short-sighted, and it does not consider the socioeconomic realities in Sudan today.
Great. I think we're already tapping into the challenges from the get-go. And would you like to comment on that?
I may add one point. First of all, I would like to thank you, USIP, for organizing this very significant event on national dialogue in Sudan. There is no doubt that national dialogue is one of the most important things that we, the Sudanese, need to do right now in order to deal with our problems, intractable problems, and actually find a way for a better future for ourselves and for the generations to come. We all agree on that, and I think what we need to discuss actually is not the necessity of this dialogue, not the meaning even of this dialogue, because there is no particular or a specific definition for national dialogue. This can be actually one of the issues that can be discussed at the beginning of the process. But we need to agree, first of all, as Majdi Juzuli mentioned, that the current political organizations do not represent genuinely the Sudanese aspirations and the Sudanese people. That is one thing that we need to actually emphasize, and I would be very glad to hear other perspectives from those who will participate on Skype. But I know that these organizations are now trying to negotiate with the government to either maintain their privileges or restore their privileges. The old political club in Sudan can reach any agreement with the government that would secure or guarantee for it what it wants from the government: participation in power, maintenance or restoration of privileges. And that is very important, which means that we need also to discuss not only those who would be participating in this process, but also the principles upon which the whole process would be established actually. We have only 3 scenarios as far as this whole process is concerned. First of all, we could either find maybe a reasonable atmosphere for national dialogue, which means that the government would take very serious decisions to make sure that everyone takes part in the process. That means the current laws that restrict freedoms should be abolished. It also means that people should be given free access to the media, and among other actually measures that should be taken. These are not conditions, these are requirements, necessary steps that should be taken in order to have a durable exercise of national dialogue. And we could have, as I mentioned, and as Dr. Abdullah mentioned, and Majdi, an agreement between the government and the organizations of the old political club. And this will prolong the life of the government indeed, but it will not sort out the chronic problems of the country. And the final scenario is to have this propaganda of national dialogue continue without having any solutions. And this will lead to the fragmentation of the country, if not in 10 years, in 20 years, or maybe more than that.
Great, thank you very much. John?
You know, I might just add that it's important that we don't discuss the concept of national dialogue within a bubble and recognize some of the other processes that are going on, and discuss then how a national dialogue type of process is going to fit into those other processes. And so what do I mean? For example, the Doha document for Darfur, how does any sort of national dialogue process feed into that for those who still think that the DDPD is something that we should hold on to? The ongoing negotiations in Addis Ababa led by the African Union high-level panel, how does that fit into this process? Dr. Al-Khatib mentioned the constitution-making process. How does a national dialogue process square with the process of needing to write a new constitution, which is also a very fundamental process which can also get at some of the underlying grievances and drivers of conflict in Sudan? And then finally, how does a national dialogue process relate to elections that are supposed to be scheduled for 2015? And I think this is a particularly important question. What I think we know from other successful national dialogue processes in other places is that they really take time. 2-3 years, maybe more. I've been a bit concerned by some of the discussion I've seen about national dialogue in Sudan saying it will happen in October. it doesn't happen in a month. It probably doesn't happen in a year. And so I think accepting that reality early on is very important. But if we accept that, then any process is going to run into 2015 when elections are scheduled. If there are elections in the midst of a genuine national dialogue process, I think there is a risk that that throws the dialogue process off track, which would be a shame if it really does have some momentum.
Yeah, you're really right, because first, the time is not only needed for the dialogue, but also for building the trust and for people to invest in it. It feels very, very like short-planned, especially with the timing of the election and the writing of the constitution. And a lot of people are speculating that the government is making this whole national dialogue in a way just to make the constitution and to resolve that question of the constitution and still run for election, which is not going to be fair even for the old school parties, because they're not on equal footing when it comes to resources and ability and capacity to run for elections. Feel free to, since we're already discussing the challenges and all that, and what about Mr. Khatib, if you could respond to the thing about the time and how the time is not enough to start or to not even to come to conclusion with the dialogue. As you just said, that a lot of people have not been, did not respond yet. And there's also the question that Majid Jazuli raised about those who are out of the traditional political parties, the non-state actors as rebels or people like who don't have a political representation. How do you think the current initiative addresses those sector of the society or groups in the society?
Well, if you can hear me.
Yes.
I think he raised, Majdi Juzuli raised a very good point. And the initiative itself, it has also addressed that. It is said that this is not only a dialogue between the political parties amongst themselves, whether these political parties are traditional or new or what have you. It needs to include all other communities in Sudan, and so that point is very much on the minds of everybody as they or before they embark on this national dialogue. And his or anybody else's suggestion as to how to include, because we are going to be faced by claims of representativeness of this or that segment of our society. And that was really the reason why it had to have been declared as an all-inclusive dialogue for everybody, so as not to even give an opportunity to any claim of denial of opportunity or banning from participation to even be raised by anybody. Having said that, so I agree with him that we need to have everybody present there, all classes, all different localities, all different interests.
Great.
And
Mr. Khatib, I'm sorry to cut
need
you
to see
off.
themselves there. But the elite that he has correctly, I again agree with him, criticized for not being 100%
Mr.
able
Al-Khatib, do you hear me?
to resolve these issues. He himself and me and probably all of your guests as Sudanese are part of that elite. So they have to be there, but other segments of Sudanese society need to be there. And that was why this invitation was sent to everybody, including, as I said earlier, to the armed groups, if they say. I mean, we are not looking here for something as radical as saying because there is an initiative for national dialogue, hereby renounce resorting to violence for good. But at least they should say, we will give this dialogue a first, the first
Yeah,
opportunity.
we will get to this part about how feasible that to have everybody. I will just give the last for Mr. Ambassador since he has to leave.
I apologize for that, and to Saeed and others. Look, whenever this kind of thing is raised, and any country has to face this, the first reaction you get is, it's hard. Yeah, it's going to be very hard. But I think to just say you're going to include everybody is also a trap, because if you invite everybody, there's no structure. So one of the first things that has to be done is to think through how you structure it. And that means perhaps a series of different dialogues or sub-dialogues that move to how you get this representation. How do you decide who represents all classes, et cetera? So there's a process here of just defining the whole, that which needs to be done. And it seems to me that one of the first steps is to put this process under a structure other than the government itself. That is, to create a vehicle that can begin to think through this, whether it's a judge or it's a structure that's respected, that begins to consult with people as to how you bring people in. And you have a series of dialogues until you have defined clearly for everyone how this will move from a general discussion to something more definitive. It's going to be difficult, and I agree with John. This is going to take some time. But the fundamental early decision on the part of the government and the others is, this is going to lead to a fundamental transformation of the way Sudan is governed. If that isn't the starting point, even though one hasn't defined exactly where that comes out, if that isn't the starting point, then people will get quickly discouraged and it won't go far. I apologize for having to step out, but I hope this dialogue continues, and I think a lot of good ideas have come.
Do you want me to unplug you? Sorry, Mr. Al-Khatib, for interrupting you earlier.
Say something about what Prince Lyman just said.
We will actually, since the structure of the dialogue has been coming up in the conversation from most of the
it's about that as well. Everybody has been talking when this initiative was made and the initial responses. And maybe rightly so, everybody was asking, what is the mechanism? Who is going to be actually seeing to it that the national dialogue actually starts and develops? And the initiative, when it was declared, it said that we, as Sudanese, all of us need to talk about this mechanism. The mechanism is very clearly, it is not the government. The mechanism itself needs to be agreed to by all who are going to be participating in this dialogue. When I say all, of course, I don't mean that you are going to consult every Sudanese about this mechanism. But those who have already responded positively are talking about the mechanism, and I think it's going to be declared, hopefully, very soon. Basically, it is going to be some sort of mechanism that is made up of Sudanese who have no affiliation to any of the political forces that are on the scene right now.
Great. I will have to
also a presence.
Mr. Al-Khatib, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but because we want to keep the mechanism at a different session so we can easily respond to that. But since we're still off the structure part, I would like to take Dr. Abdullahi, but hold that thought because we're going to go back to it when we start talking about the recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of structure and how are we going to structure this, we are talking about the entities that are present and active and in practice. Pro Nasruddin and Majdi, we are talking, we are talking about forces that are absent, not really in practice. And I mean by that what came to be known later as the civil society. And I'm not talking about civil society in general terms. I'm talking about the specific forces of labor, students, tenants, and the like. And these cannot be represented in this dialogue without a democratic environment, without liquidating certain laws that prevent free elections to trade unions, free elections to students, and tenants formations. This needs to be emphasized because this force was or has been the major force in all political changes. The parties have not been a major force in the major transformations in Sudan, and I'm specifically talking about October Revolution and 1985 revolution. The rebels were assisting factors in this transformation. They never toppled any government up to this moment, although they are the most vocal and the most vigorous today. So if you are talking about a conflict that is culturally and politically and historically ingrained, you need not to miss on these forces. And this puts it on Al-Khatib's court. What are you going to do with these forces in structuring the dialogue? How are you going to stay with what we call the labor movements, laws, trade union laws with al-munsha'a? That is, everybody in, for example, the railway, from the top leaders to the lowest paid, those are all in a trade union, which makes it a farce. What about the students? Now the students are withdrawing completely from politics. These used to be the guys who make, who really do the change by changing the balance of power. We are talking about dialogue without changing the balance of power. That can't happen. The government will always have the upper hand. Today, after the president's talk about dialogue, a guy was killed. Every day we have a newspaper ban, 2, 3, 4 at a time. And the president would go to the police forces and tell them, take all the money you want, which we call the money that is sided on the line for the special uses for these forces. So you cannot, unless you change the balance of power, you are talking about dialogue, you are talking about it being genuine, but you are really working under the shadow of Big Brother.
Great. I think we should start making the tally of all the challenges we have. First, we have the problem with the structure, that it's a bit not clear, and it only focuses on political parties and those known power. We have the problem with the time frame, that A, we have a constitution that's going to be invalid, B, we have an election that's too soon, in which it's very hard to have a viable dialogue done before then. And then we have the balance of power of who's who. And I think the balance of power, it's pretty much linked to the problem or the process of building trust. And maybe this is the first step to address is how to build the trust on the part of the government and on the part of the participants, whoever they might be. And maybe also on a sub-challenge we have the representation of others, especially that most of the trade unions and others are pretty much affiliated with the NCP. The school, the it's pretty much politicized and takes sharp affiliation with the NCP as well. So this balance of power and this is one of the challenges. Is there anything else that we've missed?
I guess I would like to comment on one idea that came up about the militias. And these militias, they are disillusioned with the government of something. Well, I think the militias have been created by the government of Sudan, and actually they are acting on behalf of the government of Sudan. If you talk about Hemeti militia, actually, they are under the sponsorship and organization and control of command by the NIS, or Sudanese Security Force or something. So there is no way that to say, they are actually acting independently. So this is very important, actually. I have to say that. The other thing also, before, going into all this kind of detail, the conducive environment for this dialogue. As I said, there have been many occasions that President Bashir and the government of Sudan say something about dialogue. They launched initiative about dialogue. I'm talking about, Djibouti in 1999 or something like that. And then another thing, actually, All Sudan Conference in 2008. And then also another thing, after time, actually, they're saying. But the question is, are they really serious this time and genuine? I'm saying this because what is happening on the ground right now, and this is one of the challenges, because there is a war. And don't not forget that, this stage, which actually, led the government of Sudan to talk about dialogue, is because there are ongoing conflict, because Sudan is at war with itself. There is a conflict now, genocide in Darfur, in South Kordofan, and Blue Nile. What we are going to do about this kind of thing? This is the government of Sudan. Since al-Bashir launched his speech in January 27, did he did anything that to convince these people and to send them positive signal that actually this time he's different? This time he really, understand and recognize their citizenship? I don't think that the situation on the ground can prove this kind of thing. Because as we see right now, there is a scorched campaign in Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile. Khorab Bashir actually attacked yesterday. The areas, just by Niala also attacked, and in Al-Fashir, ITP camps, and all this kind of thing. So what we need is, to give this kind of signals. They have to refrain from attacking civilian population. They have to refrain from harassing the ITPs. They have to refrain from, attacking and killing, innocent, students who are demonstrating or something like that. All we need, signals, positive signals that these people are really need. Because without conducive environment, there will be no trust can be built. You talk about the trust, and this is one of the challenges. Because there is a huge gap of trust that need to be filled. And I think the onus is on the government of Sudan. They have to take measures. That's why, a lot of people, they are very disappointed of al-Bashir, President Bashir, speech in January 2000, because people expected measures, tangible, kind of, procedures, and points, to convince the people. But people are disappointed because nothing actually came out of that speech until now. What they see is more attacks and more killing and more arrests and more banning us, like Dr. Ibrahim said, to newspapers and all this kind of thing. We really need a creative enabling conditions, if I may say, enabling atmosphere so that can lead the country for all this kind of thing. About the representation, I think all we say this has to be very inclusive. That actually is the time. But we need first to stop the war, to stop the conflict. This is one of the main things, and I think I referred to John, a point about the ongoing processes. There is a process actually in Addis Ababa about SPLM knows about the two areas.
Yeah, I want to talk about the ad hoc, this mechanism of, like you mentioned that, you said how you want to have all these ad hoc peace talks or negotiation to fall into that. Is that possible?
No, I don't think that you're going to get, some nice, neat package where you can make it all fit together and it's all going to work out perfectly. And, I think we have to emphasize here, we can't wait for perfection on these things in order to move forward. Now, that's not to say that the current situation is amenable to some of what we're talking about here, because I think it probably isn't right now. But this is going to be messy, and there are going to be some processes that probably sort of dissipate and disappear. But I still think that we need to be a lot more clear as to what we really mean when we say national dialogue. And it starts to be a risk of becoming this sort of all-encompassing buzzword that means different things to different people. And if you're trying to reach some sort of consensus on governance of the country and these very fundamental issues, that starts by some sort of consensus on what the process even means. And it still feels like we're a little bit ways off from that.
Yes, that's true. Because I want to throw this question again, because obviously what we mean by dialogue is completely different than what the government means. According to Sayyid al-Khatib, that they have invited everybody to talk, and maybe that's the process, and that's as far as it goes to the government at this point. Maybe the government itself needs some assurance from its own partners at this point. Well, at the other side, there are people who think that dialogue is actually sharing power. That's also my understanding. And to that end, nothing has been delivered. Actually, the environment is not conducive at all to deliver such a thing. Do you have anything, Mr. Dean?
Well, I would add that we need actually to have specific measures in place in order to start that dialogue, national dialogue. Regarding the meaning, I think we should agree or consider agreeing on defining national dialogue as a process. There are different definitions, academic definitions for national dialogue. Some people might think about it as a method. Some people might think about it as a purpose in itself, with no any commitment to reaching agreements on specific issues. But I think in our particular situation, national dialogue should be a process through which we can actually discuss the issues that were actually raised by Dr. Al-Khatib, in particular identity, the identity issues, the issue of transforming the country to democracy. This is very, very important. With regard to what we need to do before we embark on national dialogue, I think the government needs actually to abolish all the laws that restrict human rights and fundamental freedoms. That is one. Two, it also needs to limit the power of the national intelligence and security services, which has become an empire actually in Sudan. It can do whatever it wants, assassination of students, actually stopping writers from actually contributing to their newspapers, and so on. Three, we need actually to have a cessation of hostilities between the warring parties in Sudan right now. We might not be able to reach, as we know, an agreement, a peace agreement with different movements that are fighting the government for very legitimate reasons, but we need to have a cessation of hostilities. From the part of the political organizations, I think, and when I say political organizations, again, I don't mean only the political organizations of the old political club. I also mean the new forces, youth, the student organizations that are actually representing a new generation of Sudanese activists and politicians who have their own view and perspectives on how the country actually should be ruled in the future. The main question is the question of governance. So these political organizations need to take the invitation seriously. Not forever, but at least for some time. We will maybe determine 1 year or 6 months that we will take this initiative seriously, and we will wait for the government to take some practical steps towards preparing the atmosphere for actually meaningful debate over the different issues that are actually that need to be addressed.
Great, thank you. Mr. Al-Khatib, do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, I would like to refer to you about two things. One, the time of question, especially with all these issues that are at hand, like conflicts on Blue Nile, Kurdistan, Darfur. You have an economic issue also deteriorating in Sudan. You have a lot of challenges facing the government. Maybe they might be the reason for the government to rush this process of the national dialogue, but don't you think that doing that before 2015 it's too early for the process to bear fruit? And the second question, I think it's more important than the first one, is to what extent the government is actually considering crossing, reaching across the aisle to people to build that trust, not only saying that we send the invitation, you come according to our terms while everything status quo does not change. Like especially all these news about students being killed and the aggression starting again over and over again in Darfur, and like the freedom of expression and all that. To what extent is the government actually considering making the environment conducive for trust building and more invitational than just inviting people to come?
All right. You see that the quality of sound at my end here is really not that good. But I think your first question regards the time available, the timing or the time available for the discussion in this dialogue. And the second one, as I understood it, is, some sort of a conducive environment based on the premises that the environment right now is not really conducive for a free dialogue. Have I
Yes.
understood your questions correctly?
Pretty much. Yes, you're correct. One is about the time, 2015, and the other one is about the conducive environment and
Right. Right.
human rights situation in Sudan.
Right. I think the gravity of what we are getting ourselves into as a country makes time really a very important issue. So while I understand the point of people who say, are we going to be able to discuss all of these very serious issues very thoroughly in the time that is available to us now before the elections? And between those who think that there's no time to really waste anymore. We have seen the process of Somalia when they were perpetually meeting to discuss such issues in Kenya for years and years. This needs, we need to really calibrate that so that we do not do injustice to very important issues by not giving enough time, and at the same time knowing the nature of our people and our really great love for analyzing things to death and beyond. We need also to be careful not to have this as an open-ended sort of, that will defeat the purpose of this national dialogue. It is based on the fact that we have very serious challenges, and at the same time we have opportunities, and that these opportunities are not going to stay there waiting for us until we finish splitting all hairs and doing all kinds of in-depth analyses.
Okay, I have a question for you of that. When you say that there's no time for this, I do understand, like, especially given all the challenges the government is facing. But at this point, are you, like, because the elections, there's also a constitution that's going to be invalid. And don't you think for the process of making a more genuine constitutional reforms and rewriting that, don't you think that the political environment should be not like now? And for that political environment to improve, to produce a constitution that is going to be a permanent constitution, don't you think that the political parties and political players should have enough time to prepare themselves? They should have worked through all the weeds of the conflict that's been there for 25 years. The country has been at war since the beginning, so you cannot finish that in less than a year and a half.
I beg to differ. I think if people come to convene with seriousness around the table and talk about these issues, I think 1.5 years is quite adequate time for people to resolve the major issues that need to be actually fed into a constitutional drafting process, because you cannot go into this thinking that we are going to resolve every single problem that Sudan is faced with.
True. What about that, Mr. Khatib? I have a follow. I know, like, there's so much to say about the topic, but of your point that you just made, don't you think that one of the major issues that will take us again to making the environment conducive, don't you think the most important thing now that actually the government activates the laws in the Constitution currently about human rights and freedom of expression, and don't you think that could build the trust needed for this process to happen? It could happen actually in a year if the environment is more conducive, if there's more trust brought to the table.
About the environment being conducive, like I indicated earlier when I was talking about Mr. Juzuli's remarks, I think everything that needs to be done or can be done to make the environment more conducive to a free dialogue should be done by the government. And I think there is latitude for that. I think many things are being contemplated. But I need to make a point here. People need to differentiate between demands or ideas that are supposed to be more of the nature of what needs to come as an outcome of this dialogue, and between CBMs. These are different things. And so because you are going to open the debate and close it before the dialogue itself starts, people are going to say from this side, human rights are not yet to the level that would make this dialogue flourish. You will find people from the other side, not only the government, but those who want to enter into this dialogue and have others not come to this dialogue will say, no, the human rights situation is fine. You don't want that to start before the dialogue itself starts. You don't want that to be some sort of a bone of contention before all Sudanese come to discuss it seriously and intelligently. So CBMs, like, for example, declaring acquiescing, I might say. And mind you, I'm not speaking for the government here. I'm speaking as an observer who sees what is going on and who can claim that this thing the government would do or not do. I think some of these things are going to be met to an extent that is going to be considered by the government as reasonable, and by some of those who have welcomed the government's invitation as reasonable.
Great.
So I think
thank you. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you. I'm really sorry, but it's just the time.
I want to tell you that I'll be also discontinuing. I'm finding difficulties, and I have to run anyway. And before going away, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
Availing me of this opportunity. And I also would like to salute the other participants in this dialogue. Thank you very much.
Sorry for the difficulties. Thank you. Majdi?
Shame that Said decided to leave, but there's a point of criticism to be made about how the discussion has been going. I think the first is how abstract it has all become. I mean, and the abstraction, I think, comes from the assumption that you're talking about a negotiation process between the political forces of the mainstream. And that's why issues like political freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of association come second. Because for a meeting between Turabi and President Bashir to happen, or between Turabi and Sadiq, or Sadiq and Bashir to happen, you don't really need a lot of political freedom. You just need to jump in from one house to another. But for a genuine political process that has a popular nature, that involves people and wider organizations, you need freedom of expression. This is not an outcome of the process. This is the initial precondition of it. And if these freedoms are not there, are not available, and people can't clutch them, then there is no national dialogue to talk about. Now, Abdullah earlier on said something about the balance of power, which brings us back from this abstraction of a process, of a liberal-minded process that is designed top-down by a decree of government or by a speech of a president, into a matter that brings in people into the political arena. And this is exactly what we need. And I don't think this is something that is going to happen by deliverance from a government. This is something that's going to happen by organization, where people have political demands. The fact that the government cannot see these things now or is not willing to see them abolishes the idea of a national dialogue in itself and leaves us at the space of conflict. Of course, conflict is not always armed, but the forms of conflict that we are now seeing are heading more and more towards an armed nature, and political conflict is becoming much more difficult than it was because people don't have avenues to show their politics or demonstrate their politics because they're reduced to the basic minimum of political existence. Now, the idea that the government can continue talking about national dialogue without translating this into a popular process makes it all a bit ridiculous, I must say.
You're right. We need to, I think, more focus about how to make this conducive. And I think, again, we're going back to the point of John and the others about the definition of a national dialogue. I think we are seeing it from different perspective. And I think for the government...
Well, one assumption is that the national dialogue is something like an extended CPA negotiation process, but we've seen where that ends. Anything that doesn't have a popular element to it and that is not associated with some sort of political emancipation, allowing people freedom of association and freedom of organization to show what these issues are, because the issues that I can see now are totally limited to power sharing, really. It's all about bargaining, shares and cuts in ministries. But these are not the socio-economic realities of the country. These are not the daily concerns of people who would be candidates for inclusion in this political process. And I think we should hear from the others what this differentiation is between an elite bargain and a popular process. And I think that's the heart of the matter. Are we heading towards an elite bargain, something like the CPA in an extended fashion, including the mainstream political parties, or are we heading to a popular process that brings in communities and people and organizations who have been out of the terrain? And this is in essence also a class issue.
Great, thank you so much. That's interesting points. Dr. Abdullah?
Yeah, regarding the how to introduce some new blood into this. We need to distinguish between a national dialogue and the kind of conflict resolutions, negotiations that have been the order of the day for a long time. And I'd like just now to look at Addis Ababa at this time. You know, we have people coming from Sudan to negotiate a settlement, and people from southern Sudan coming to negotiate a settlement. Look also at the government of Sudan is now trying or ended trying people like Yasser Arman and all those. Look at the situation in southern Sudan in which people like Baghdad Mom and all these people are being tried before court. So for how long are we going to go this path? We need to despair at one point of time and look at other things. So that we seem to have come to the end of this road. And although we, as John said, we need to keep the fruits of this road, Doha and all those things. And many Sudanese are frustrated because some American diplomats were talking about the Doha has expired or ended or something like that. But we need to keep all these things, and we turn to a kind of a national dialogue in the term that we are trying to define. And most importantly, because the kind of dialogue, the kind of negotiations taking place now in Addis Ababa and in other places have been designed, conceived as what you call it, putting out fires. for a long time, the guy who seems to attract the attention of the government and the international community is a rebel with a gun. And this is the reason why the civil society kind of fell through the cracks. And in the rare moment they remember this civil society, they are talking about capacities and things like that, and picking here and picking there. So we need to understand why we have this kind of stalemate. Things like emblematic now in Addis Ababa. These are enduring conflicts. And enduring conflicts is about society, about politics, about culture ingrained in this. And the international community have been all the time trying to put out fires without really looking at the civil society. Although, as I said, the civil society in Sudan is robust, is vigorous, and it has been tried as a force of change. And people are now trying to say, okay, why don't you have an Arab Spring? Like this is a must. Or like
No,
this
we will have it in our own terms.
Yeah.
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 I guess.
Yes. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I very much agree with the point that the international community has a tendency to focus a lot on the firefighting and the crisis of the day without simultaneously being able to focus on the longer term change. But I want to go back to Majdi's point about how to make this a popular process and not an elite process, because I think that really is at the crux of the issue. And I think there's a lot of open questions about if and how that's possible. I think that raises a real question about the role of the international community in any sort of national dialogue process. And when I say international community, I'm not really talking about the West or the US. I'm talking more about Africa and the sort of closer international community. But is there a way for Africa to help to carve out the space needed for national dialogue? If you look back at some of the consultations that happened in Darfur prior to the AU report on Darfur, President Mbeki's report, they did pretty extensive consultations around Darfur. There were some flaws, and some others can probably pick up on that, but they were also consultations unlike any others that have happened, at least in the recent peacemaking process, in terms of, from my understanding, participation and some frank dialogue happening. So is that somewhat of a model that can be used throughout the country in order to have the kind of grassroots popular consultations that need to feed into some sort of a larger process? I don't know the answer to that, but I think we need to start looking at those concrete ideas as to how to create the space that we all, I think, agree is needed in order for a genuine process to unfold.
Okay, thank you, John. I have a question that also falls between what John just said and Amjad and Majdi. It's like, to what extent people actually going to feel safe to say what they want? And again, that takes us to the conducive environment. To what extent people who are not affiliated with any one of the political parties, who are not part of any civil society, just like individuals, and to what extent they are safe to say what they want, what is the mechanism of TUGAG, how they want it to be. And there's so many questions also about the transitional justice and how it's going to be part of the national dialogue. This is also comes up a lot in the conversation. Would you?
I just want to say that, the nature of the regime is different from the nature of the regimes in, during Nimeri time or during Abu time in 1964 or something like that. Because now we have, hundreds of militias. So the entire country is very, very armed. So it's very difficult, to say that, this is just without political will from the government is going to be ended just peacefully or something like that. So let's remind ourselves with that one. And also the current struggle, armed struggle actually, whether in Darfur or South Kordofan and Blue Nile, has, legitimate kind of ground. Because, this is because of the failure of the post-colonial state and the failure of the elite you can say them the fathers of the independence or those who actually associated with them or something. They failed actually to build a state that to be inclusive with inclusive citizenship. That's why all this kind of problems also, are happening right now, and there is a military struggle or something. Also, one of the challenges and the dangers, this is not going to be elite or something. Also, there is a danger that this also to be like northern, I mean, northern rebellion kind of process or something, without actually including or without putting on board from the beginning people actually from Darfur, from South Kordofan and Blue Nile. This is one of the main dangers. And let me also say, there will be no legitimacy or support for any kind of dialogue without actually people on the ground they feel it, safety, feel it, in terms of security and all this kind of thing. As I said, there is bleeding actually. People are bleeding right now actually on the ground. And I think we have actually to consider this, in a proper way. Freedom of expression, I think one of the demands, very, very important, but also actually the safety of the people on the ground, I think also one of the
yeah,
important
it's
things.
pretty much, actually it says it all. If someone
About
is
the role about the international community. And I think the role of the international community, I think, is very important because, as I said, we just mentioned that.
But what do you think about the point that John raised that a regional force actually has been more closer to the situation and had more consultation and could help more with the popular part of the...
Because we already actually tested the regional organization. I remember very well in 2004 we met with Said Janet. He was the director of Peace and Security Council of the African Union. At that time he said Darfur was a test case for the African Union. And they said that they would succeed actually in this test case. But actually the role of the African Union is complete failure in terms of
even in
security,
recent
in terms
ones?
of security, in, peace, in terms of political process and all this kind of thing. From what I see is right now, I'm very proud to be African. I actually support the African Union, but with the current leadership of the African Union and current capacity, I think they cannot actually be able to facilitate this kind of national dialogue. What we need is actually, multi, organization, from different kind of international community, the, United States and others, especially also Security Council and some European countries, African countries, they have become form some sort of forum. Maybe you can call it Friends of Sudan or something like that. To facilitate, bringing the people together. Because the current mistrust is going to be very difficult, for the Sudanese actually to come together, actually. And I know that this is Sudanese process and has to be Sudanese process, but we need facilitators. But the African Union cannot facilitate this in any way. But my last answer also is, this shouldn't be dictated by the NCP. This should be owned by the Sudanese stakeholders.
We will come back to the structure part, and that's very interesting, John. Maybe you wouldn't want to respond after we go to Majdi. Majdi, you have something to say?
I'd like to comment on the African Union process in that forum. I think, as John rightly said, it was one of the most successful processes that the AU in Sudan ever organized. The problem was it never came to fruition. What the final outcome of it, apart from the report, was very little. But the way in which it was done, the scope, the length, the participation was magnanimous. One must say that. And I think it might not be exactly the model to follow, but it's definitely the type of engagement you need. On the other hand, you would probably require levels of organization from the communities involved to bring in themselves and their own forms of organization, their own agency, and not this dictate by a government or by the United Nations Security Council, as much as I care, or even by the African Union. There is a level of agency that has to be kept to the people involved and not immediately delivered to a mediator or a supervisor or a facilitator. And this type of agency was to a degree visible in the AU process when Thabo Mbeki was playing it out before he turned into other issues, when his focus was Darfur. It was pretty interesting. And the types of issues that came out brought us away from this prison of thinking around power sharing all the time and who has guns and who doesn't. It allowed people who don't have guns to make their voice heard, because it's not restricted to the warring parties. The idea that political problems and social problems, economic problems in Sudan are limited to the warring parties is a false one. And it only creates more warring parties. It invites more people into the battlefield. but it does not reduce the capacity for violence when you only focus on these players. The one big advantage of the AU process in Darfur was exactly this. It allowed other people who do not have arms to play in the field, to be involved, to have a voice and to organize. But it's not only about having a voice, it's also about organizing political forms, novel political forms that would contribute to a wider process. And in that regard, Sudan is not a blank slate. I mean, there is a long tradition of indigenous political organization in the country. It has taken multiple and varied forms through its history, going as far back as the Mahdiya and as recent as 1985. People are pretty ingenious in devising their forms of political organization. And this agency has to be restored to the citizens of the country.
Great, thank you very much. I have a question for you, Nasruddin, about the transitional justice. And how do you see that as a part of the national dialogue? And whether should it come first or it be addressed at later point?
Well, I think justice in general should be one of the principles on which we should agree as one, things that we need to make sure that it's not compromised during or after the process of national dialogue. This means that we should make sure that every body who committed or commits human rights violations or fundamental freedoms should be held responsible through domestic or international justice mechanisms. We know that we have a lot of issues right now. We had a lot of issues in the past that have to do with justice, and justice should certainly be one of the principles of national dialogue.
What about the big elephant in the room, the ICC, and how are we going to deal with that?
Well, I think we should also make sure that we don't compromise this issue. Justice is very necessary for any durable peace in Sudan. It is necessary for stability. And that is one issue that we should actually emphasize while we are talking about this national dialogue process. Justice, as we know, can be done domestically, and it can also be done internationally, depending on the situation of those who can actually be tried domestically. But we know that there are people who cannot be tried locally or domestically because they are powerful, and the whole this ICC system was actually invented to deal with this kind of issues. We should not compromise that.
Great. Dr.
But
Abdullahi?
you can see that I think we are trying really to, there is some revision of that, at least probably not in Sudan, but if you read Lyman's proposal, and if you read Abeke and Mamdani's, and I think a reading of trying really to balance between justice and democracy and peace. I think when we refer to the South African experiment, it seems to support mostly the question of peace over or stability, democracy over justice, because they even the African National Party was condemned because of its atrocities, which are very limited and very narrow. And when the African National Party protested, Bishop Tutu was told them no. President Mandela said them no. We need to accept that. So there is this question of the elephant in the room. What are we going to do with it? We can keep talking about people being accountable and things like that, but what ultimately we are left with in Sudan with the ICC is a wounded beast in Sudan. And this is a personal problem and a system problem. The guy is having his back to the wall. elections won't serve any purpose because he would like to be there. So I'm not saying, give him a safe way, but would we accept a negotiations taken properly as we are trying to design it now? Are we going to accept the Lyman's proposal, Baker's proposal? This needs to be addressed, particularly in places like Darfur and in between themselves and in southern Kordofan, rebels generally, because this seems to be like the thing that they keep talking about it. I would like to say one further word about popular movements and how can we help them. We are trying to look at the African Union, this and that, but I'd like to have a look at the rebel movement, people with the gun. How are they helping the civil society movements? Look at the Sudan liberation movements when they came with the CBA and something like that. They never paid any attention to the question of democracy within Khartoum and within the north and in the totality of the country. Today, we have a kind of a revolving door. Movements coming, Darfur movements especially, they come, they agree with the dictator, and they split. Look at Dabages, look at Sisi, look at Minawis. They come, they make negotiations. Sometimes they say, okay, we would like to have the governor of Khartoum. How are you going to help democracy when you're so determined that Khartoum is going to be yours? And what about 3-5 million people in Khartoum who would like to vote for someone, irrespective, whether it's Darfurian or anything? So these kind of deals and quotas that these movements and splitting movements do with the regime, they perpetuate this regime. And so they need to think about how they are going to conjoin the cause for democracy and genuine democracy and how to pursue their military tactics.
Comment on this, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, about the issue of justice and the ICC. Actually, there were crimes even before the ICC come into being, in Sudan. There is no question about that. And the ICC actually came just after 2007 or something, and the conflict has been since 2003 or something. But in Sudan, we have, to know this. We are not in a post-conflict situation, and we are not in a post-genocide actually situation. And still, the political leadership of the country still is a state of denial and deception, because right now they are denying that there have been crimes or something, and the crimes are going on as we speak. Actually, the crimes are continuing actually on the ground. So the issue of justice, I think, is very, very important issue and cannot be compromised. And I think when you want to talk about the issue of justice, also you need to bring the victims and survivors. And all we are talking about here about the international crimes. We are talking about genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And all this kind of crimes is international jurisdiction, so there is no amnesty or any kind of immunity actually regarding them. I have different, kind of opinions, Ambika and the others, and I think should I reply to them because they are talking about those who committed crime because of political violence or something shouldn't be tried or something, and I think that's wrong. I think it's not going to be in Sudan. So in Sudan right now, if you need actually to have a stability and peaceful that actually recognized by the others and put all the people actually on the ground on this peace process, you need actually to recognize the issue of justice and to embrace justice. About this incremental political processes, I myself, I don't agree, with this kind of, processes. You need some sort of comprehensive, kind of process. But actually, the approach of the regime itself, the regime seems to be very tempted for this kind of incremental, because they don't want to discuss all the issues together, and even the regional community and in the international community. So that the thing. But what I say is there is legitimate kind of, concern right now, whether in Darfur, South Kordofan, or Bologna need to be, to be recognized and to be embraced. And right now, I guess I want to tell you that the Sudanese society is so divided. You know, if you talk about people in Khartoum or other places or something, we need actually some sort of racial reconciliation. We need, you know, social healing. This is very important.
something
But
goes
right
first
now,
and
but
then
right now, if you say that, you know, we don't accept the people of Darfur or the marginalized or their armed struggle or something, well, you know, this didn't come, you know, out of blue or something. This is because of the failure of the Sudanese state, which was so centralized and actually confined to very small minority of the people or something. We need, you know, inclusive state. That's what we have to discuss on the national dialogue. National dialogue should, that a process should bring together all the stakeholders to discuss the fundamental issues that actually led to the failure of the Sudanese state, post-colonial Sudanese state. Issue of identity should be discussed. The issue of state and religion should be discussed. The issue of, you know, structural change of the country, which is to transform the entire country to a new country that embraces all its citizens. These are the issues which should be discussed. This shouldn't be about elite. This shouldn't be about political, you know, parties or something. It should be all-inclusive, serious kind of dialogue and a process to bring the people together. But first, we need also to address the issue of war and peace. These are fundamental issues, and I think even President Bashir recognized it and in his speech or something like that. But we need all the elite, you know, to compare. You know, we ask all the elite actually from north or from different places, you know, to understand and to recognize actually the concern and the pain of the people of the margin. This is very, very important. But about the African Union, I don't think that the African Union experience, I was there. The African Union experience, whether in Darfur, in different places, actually was not a success at all. We know that the African Union is protecting their member of the club. We know that. I know that the African Union has very kind of developed, you know, document or something, but they are not acting according to this kind of development or something. If you see what they do about the exposure of the crimes actually in Darfur, what they did about the, you know, protecting the people actually, you know, on the ground, nothing actually. So what I see is the experience of the African Union is not, actually was not a success at all. That's why we need, you know, some sort of, you know, consortium or some sort of forum can bring all those who are concerned about the peace and security in Sudan.
Maybe we need to discuss the question of the expectation of a regional player. John, do you have something to comment?
Well, just briefly on that, I think some of Ahmed's observations are quite valid based on his experience. I do think that the AU has evolved over recent years and is not what it was a decade ago. Its intervention a decade ago, I think, did leave a lot to be desired. But I also wanted to go back to Dr. Abdullahi's point about the rebels, because I think that's an important part of the conversation here. And I think they really need to be tested in their avowed commitment to a peaceful process of change. They say at every turn that we prefer a peaceful process, we'll continue the fighting, but we prefer a peaceful process. Well, I think we, the internationals and Sudanese, need to hold them to that, need to see how committed they are to that rhetoric. Now, we heard Dr. Al-Khatib say everybody is invited. That's a big if. But if that really is the case, then I do hope that the rebel movements will participate. There's a lot of reason to be skeptical. There are some of those movements that don't participate in much of anything. And I think for that, they should be marginalized. But I hope that if this is the kind of process that we're hearing it is, and again, big if, need to underline that, then I really do hope that we're going to see more significant political participation by the rebels than we have seen so far.
Thank you. Majdi?
Yes.
Are you with us?
Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Do you have anything to comment?
I almost fell asleep. No, I have 2 points to make. The first is about the African Union, because I wasn't talking in general terms about the African Union's involvement in Darfur. I was talking about the process that the African Union panel on Darfur did once upon a time. So this was the limits of my comment. The second, and this is about the rebel movements, I don't think we have political experience in Sudan has gone beyond the point where a gun should secure for the government or for an insurgent force automatic advantage over everybody else. And the problem with the peacemaking that is only centered around warring parties is that it guarantees some blank advantage to people who have guns. And in that regard, the governments and the rebel movements play roles that are interchangeable, because they move in and out of government. And this is the example of the SPLM-N, for instance, which moved in and out of government. We've seen it as a rebel movement, and we've seen it also as a governing force. It was part of the government. The same applies to Mini Manawi. We've seen the performance of Mini Manawi in government and in rebellion. So this revolving door between government and rebel should at some point be closed in favor of a popular door, because these are not the sole political actors in the country.
Thank you. I have something for you guys to talk about, which is the election in 2015. And going back again to the big elephant in the room, Dr. Abdullah, you said that he would like to be in the office in 2015. And technically, he should not be running for election in 2015 as per the Constitution that is expiring in 2015. So what is the thing that, let's say the national dialogue doesn't work, let's say that it's not fulfilling all the perception or all the aspiration that we think it should, how are we going to deal with the election question?
Okay, and I think elections under this regime gained a very bad reputation, because, as I said, it is not just an election, it is a safety valve, or it is someone who would like to hide behind it. And from my experience of the last election, the parties, or those running against the NCB, share or a lot of the blame. They really, they were mostly on the side of complaining and not on the side of doing positive things. By really, if you say this is forged, what evidence do you have? And I remember that a young lad, a kid, in one of the remotest parts of Eastern Sudan, used his cell phone to document a forgery there. And he took it to the highest court, and the highest court ruled that that was a forgery. The whole gamut of candidates and all those things have had no evidence. It's just talk, no real evidence that is presentable before a court. And as such, they started to be very phobic about elections. And so it is not, it's not a possibility now. It is not a venue. People are talking about boycotting it if it is not like, if the government does not dismantle itself. So the government is not going to dismantle itself. They are going to run if there is a kind of transitionary government or something like that. So it is going to create, it is not the kind of thing that you know, elections, supposedly elections are cure all ills in all societies, but not in Sudan with the specific conditions we have. So we really need to think of an alternative way of doing it, or postponing it at a time when you say confidence is being built or something like that.
Well, from what we understood, that the government is not willing to postpone it, and
because they need it, not because there is any wisdom in that. They need elections fast to give this guy and their party another
buying time. What about the Constitution? What is the political, the legal framework for that if the Constitution expires in 2015?
Could I add a question to Mr. Dimna?
For you, both of you.
What is the problem with the Constitution that we have? I heard the very expert lawyers say, why don't we work on what we have?
Well, that is a very good question. And I think having a constitution that is owned by the people is an important thing in any national dialogue. The current constitution is one of the best constitutions in Africa in terms of defining the Sudanese state. In terms of human rights, fundamental human rights, there are some issues that should be added actually, but it is one of the best constitutions when it comes to its Bill of Rights as well. Maybe we need to think about the form of government in the current constitution. It speaks about a system of government that is not clearly a federal system of government. And at the same time, it is a decentralized system of government, but it doesn't speak about federalism properly. So maybe we need to maintain some parts of the constitution, especially when it comes to the definition of the Sudanese state. It recognizes that Sudan is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, a multicultural state, and this is good. Maybe we need, especially when it comes to this part, to add that maybe some Sudanese languages should be recognized as official or national languages. That is one
Do you
thing.
think that
This can be dealt with maybe in the first part of the constitution, or in the part that deals with fundamental freedoms and rights.
Do you think the question of the constitution can be done independent from the dialogue, or it should be part of the dialogue? Because I feel like it has its own urgency.
A proper national dialogue process should have committees or commissions, technical committees that should be tasked with dealing with certain issues, certain problems, and I think there should be a committee that should draft or revise the current constitution so that it could include issues that are not actually addressed properly by the constitution, especially when it comes to the form of government. I participated in a series of workshops in 2012 that took me to Western Sudan, to Eastern Sudan, to Central Sudan, and indeed in Khartoum we organized a 2 or 3 day actually workshop that spoke about the issues that should be included in the constitution, the current constitution, that should be the permanent constitution of Sudan. And one of the issues that was actually raised repeatedly by participants was the issue of federalism. People want a genuine federal government. This will partially address the issue of governance in Sudan.
Okay, thank you. John, I have a question for you. Do you think it's necessary for President Bashir to step down for these reforms to be viable?
I think you asked the wrong panelists.
Well, it was online.
Well, it's a very good question, but I don't think it's a question for me, the only non-Sudanese person here, to answer. But I do think that a political transition needs to be part of the conversation here. And I do think that President Bashir's future is a part of the conversation here, and it gets back to the elephant in the room. And I'm glad that you raised that elephant, because it really does exist. And what is his political future? What is his personal future? These have to be part of the dialogue, and that has to happen both within Sudan, but it's also a larger international community question because of the involvement of the ICC. And I think there's a lot of good arguments on either side of the equation. But if there is a conversation about a transition in power and about somebody other than President Bashir leading this country, then there also needs to be a conversation about where is he going to go and what does his future hold. And both of those things are very much related to each other, and you can't just talk about one without talking about the other.
Thank you. Anyone has a take on that?
The issue on the constitution, I think, expired already in July 2011. That there is no question. So it's not going to expire in 2015 because it was drafted and or came into force actually in January 2005, and I think expired with the separation or independence of South Sudan. This is very important information. But about the issue of elections, I think election also should be part of the national dialogue, because from what I see is the national dialogue actually should produce some sort of interim or transitional kind of mechanism, including maybe transitional government, a transitional government of main test, actually task force. Aims and objective actually is maybe to create the environment for new election or something. I'm not talking about the election that to be run or to be, just organized by Bashir or something, because it's going to be new elections and actually it's going to lead the country in new chaos. That should be very, very important. About the Bashir fate, as I said, it's new transition, it has to be established in the country. And I don't think that, with all he has done and I still doing, he can be part of any kind of new transition or nation building process. This is, if we really need, the country to heal actually its wounds, and we really want to establish some sort of national reconciliation and meaningful kind of change of the country, I think he shouldn't be part of any kind of transition.
Great. We'll take Majdi. Majdi?
Oh, hello.
Yes, I'm not going to let you sleep today.
This will be my final comment, and then I'll have to leave it here, I'm afraid.
Okay.
The presidents in Sudan generally don't leave by themselves. I mean, this would be extraordinary if he just stepped down. And the expectation that an officer in power would step down for the general good of the nation is a bit hyped, I'm afraid. And this brings us to the point that Abdullah raised about the balance of power. And that's in essence what it's about. The balance of power right now does not allow for such a smooth transition. And the objective maybe is how to alter that balance in the favor of a more national and inclusive process, as has been discussed. But without this change in balance of power, this is unlikely to take place. Elections, in a sense, the government, as you rightly said, is very much interested in holding elections in time. In 2015, with the clear objective of reinstating the president in his seat and keeping the NCP in the saddle, which is a valid thing to do if you're a ruling party. However, the technique of boycotting elections so cheaply is also not going to get the opposition anywhere. Elections are not only there to be won, they are also there to be fought. And through fighting elections, you might win ground. And Abdullah himself has a bit of experience around this. And he has experienced immediately how this happens. But he was a man standing alone. I mean, of course, there was support around him, but there wasn't a political, generous political organization around him. In the presence of that political organization, we might secure gains from elections by bringing people into the political stream. And you can see that also within the NCP. For instance, people like the governors of Gadarif or Abdelhamid Musakasha in South Darfur, they did quite a bit of agitation within NCP constraints that had a popular bend to it. The notion would be how to bring more politics into the ground and not less. Thank you. And with this, I think I have to
Thank you very much, Majdi, for joining us. We have 5 minutes to go, so thank you so much for being with us.
A footnote here.
Yes.
Yeah, Majdi said that, military rules just don't go like that. But there is a kind of an illusion in the Sudanese elite mind that President Aboud just resigned because people were like clamoring for his, and he said, okay, these people just don't like me. I'm going to resign. And this was a lie. This is a lie. This is 100% lie, because Aboud was driven by young officers. They climbed the wall of the Republican Palace to tell him go. And he was insisting till the last moment, and this was recorded then, at that time, by Cliff Thompson, a professor at Wisconsin University, who were an eyewitness there. Another just footnote by way of this metaphor of elephant in the room. I think Bashir belongs to the army. People just wrongly assign him to the Muslim Brothers. And people still believe that the Muslim Brothers they are not. We have been barking the wrong tree for 25 years. The Muslim Brothers dissolved their movement on day one, and they lost it until today, and these angry guys are trying to restore it. So I have two metaphors here. There is an elephant of the room, that is the army, that we need really to address. And when we address not Bashir, when we address the armed forces as such, I think Bashir's position would be clarified.
We should have actually addressed that point during the challenges, because one of the requirements for protecting the reforms is having a professional army. To what extent do we have a professional army in Sudan, and to what extent the government is willing to have a professional army? And what about those rebels? How are you going to accommodate them within
It is a professional army, but an army that got disassociated from the nation. Just like in Algeria, just like in Egypt, just like in Syria. This is an army that has a nation and not a nation that has an army. And 70% of the budget goes where?
Yeah.
And who is going to guard and to manage and to protect the 70% of the budget?
Sure. Since we are wrapping up, I would like to thank you all for joining us. And John, please give closing remarks.
Well, let me thank you as well for being a wonderful host, and thank our other panelists, and thank our other people who were kind enough to join us from around the world and stay up late on Skype. And also to thank some people who you don't see on the screen here, which is all the people who helped to make this production a reality. They put a lot of work into this over the last few weeks that I've seen. This is the first time we've ever done anything like this at USIP, and I think it seems like it's gone very well. Look forward to watching it myself, and I think we'll probably be doing more of it. Particularly Arif Omer, who's here behind the camera, a Sudanese fellow who we have here, who it was his idea to do this several months ago, and he has made this a reality, and so we thank him very much for this. And I think it's been a very fulfilling conversation. I hope it's the first of many on these really important national dialogue conversations, and I hope we're going to see a genuine, participatory, inclusive national dialogue in Sudan in the near future.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.